My novel, Shadow of the Lion, took me 15 years to write and research, and it was a very long novel. So when it was accepted for publication, the publisher said he thought it would be best if we divided it into two. So the first part, Shadow of the Lion, Blood on the Moon, covers the story from the death of Alexander in 323 BC, the naming of the two joint kings. One is his infant son, his only heir, and his mentally challenged half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, and their journey from Babylon back to Macedonia. The second book, Shadow of the Lion, The Fields of Hades, is all about the wars of the successors of Alexander's successors, including the women who were all vying for a part of the kingdom. And so the theme of the book is how blind ambition and greed brought down a world power, which seems these days to be very relevant. I'm going to read a little teeny bit from each book, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I develop my characters. This is all written from, it's fiction, but it's written from historic timeline. But my interpretation of the characters is where most of the fiction comes in from what I've learned about them. So I'll start with just the very beginning of the book, and then a very short passage after the child is born, which was a month after Alexander died. It starts, Babylon, 28th day of the moon of Panos, June 323 BC. In the old palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, oh no, I started at the wrong, sorry. The sound of lamentation began shortly past dawn. The keening spread like brush fire from the palace through the streets of Babylon to the crowd that had gathered in stunned silence before the temple of Marduk. The great Alexander was dead. All night his men had filed by his deathbed to pay their respects. Although he could not speak, he had acknowledged each one with a blink of his eyes, a slight smile, the weak squeeze of his hand. Finally he ceased to breathe, and they gazed stupefied, while the lamenting eunuchs covered his body with a thin linen sheet. Now, outside of Marduk's temple, they waited, unbelieving, still hoping that the gods could provide a miracle. In the heat of summer, Babylon sizzled like a cauldron of molten gold. The malicious Samuel, its hot breath as swift as lightning, blew across the sand flats, a singeing flame of wind that burned everything in its path. Even now, as the sun dipped behind the palm groves and the shadows began to lengthen, the torrid heat clung relentlessly in every corner of the city. Inside the temple, in front of the graven image of the winged god, the Magi made their final invocation. A plume of smoke drifted up from the altar where the sacred flame had been extinguished. The old Chaldean seer who tended the shrine of the god stood by silently, the empty ewer still in his hand. A shaven acolyte, his hands full of the precious incense he had used for the tribute, looked up at him with stricken eyes. "We did all we could," his voice caught with a sob. "We had warned him of the omens. He was a foreigner after all." The Chaldean in his tall felt mitre and indigo robe bowed his head, making a ritual gesture over the hissing embers. "It was foretold in the stars," he said, "the death of the king. I fear what will become of us." He turned away from the altar wearily. The fragrance of incense still hung in the air, mingling with the smoke of the smoldering ashes. This is a tragic day for Babylon. When fire falls from the heavens, it's a great calamity for all. So a month after his death, Alexander's Sogdian wife Roxana, who the Macedonians didn't really accept, gave birth to a boy who was Alexander's only legal heir. And in this scene, Alexander's illegitimate half-brother Ptolemy, who later becomes the first Ptolemaic emperor of Alexandria, comes to visit her. The scent of jasmine hung heavy on the humid night air. The tranquility of the gardens seemed like another world, far from the chaos that threatened in the city. Roxana beckoned for him to follow her down the shrub-lined path toward the tiers of the ornamental trees and the plants of the hanging gardens beyond the terrace. She walked through the dark beside him, her light footsteps brushing the paving stones. The only sounds were their footfalls and the jingling of her bracelets. She began to speak quietly, as though she was afraid to break the silence. Her voice trembled. She drew in a long breath and said suddenly, "Do you believe that Alexander was poisoned?" Ptolemy felt the shock of her words and measured his reply carefully. There were some of us who thought so. The fact is, it couldn't be proven. We all knew Alexander was ill. All of us had recurring bouts of swamp fever, the curse of the Okus River, and the Bactrian campaigns. Then there was India. He drew in his breath painfully. The arrow he took in his chest at Malia. He paused, agonizing over the memory. The long march across the Makran desert. Every step was like death for him. But Alexander valued his pride above his life. He never asked us to do anything he would not do himself. He saved my life once when I was struck by a poisoned arrow. He risked his life many times for his men. He shook his head sadly. None of their bravery, none of their gold, none of the prayers they offered to the gods at Babylon's fire altars could bring Alexander back to them. We loved him, he said, and when he died, part of us died too. They had come round the garden back into the soft moonlight of the courtyard. Ptolemy glanced around uneasily. Outside the garden walls, the high-pitched voices of the eunuch guards trilled. Their gossip would circulate through the whole palace by morning. It would not be wise to linger in the harem too long. He followed Roxana as she stepped into the flood of lamplight in the open doorway. The old bedchamber with its heavy Assyrian columns and antique furniture was redolent with the scent of nard. A round-faced young nurse sat beside the baby's cradle, keeping a watchful eye over him as he slept. Roxana motioned her away and drew Ptolemy closer so he could view the sleeping child. The baby stirred, a hint of a smile twitching at the corners of his delicate mouth. Ptolemy reached out his hand to touch the fine dark fluff on the infant's head. Iskander will be raised as a Persian, Roxana declared. Ptolemy did not comment. He recalled Alexander's childhood, how his mother Olympias had tried to dominate him and turn him against his father Philip. Alexander had been scarred by the hatred between his parents. Ptolemy wished he could take charge of Alexander's child himself. In his youth, he had always been there for Alexander, but this child did not have anyone to teach him the ways of a soldier and king. As he studied the sleeping infant in the ornate cradle, he felt a tug of melancholy. How would this imperial child survive without a father to protect him? He remembered Alexander saying that he had no time to stay at home in Macedon to marry and wait for the birth of children. He did not even wait to see his son. And a short piece from the beginning of Fields of Hades. They have just, by this time, the kings are in charge of a general named Polypertian, and he's taking them back into Macedonia to Pella, to the royal city of Pella. But just as they had arrived there, they had learned that the old regent who was in charge of things was dying. So they're heading first to the regent's house. And by this time, the little boy is about 5 years old. The child rode beside Aridaeus amid their bodyguards along the wide cobbled avenue that led into Pella, where people stood in expectant clusters. Faint, curious murmurs could be heard among the bystanders. There was cheering, but it was Polypertian the crowd cheered for, a kinsman's welcome. Their voices raised in hoarse cries of admiration. Except for these accolades and the little bursts of applause from some youths who had come out of curiosity to see the kings, the crowd stayed silent as the royal entourage passed. When at last Iskander heard his name, Alexander, Alexander, resounding up and down the streets, he did not know that cries were not for him, but for the man they had loved who would never return. It was late afternoon. The sun had lowered behind the mountains. A light brown mist hung over Palace Lake, swirling around the base of the knoll, where a palace rose above the slate rooftops. They passed through a maze of narrow streets until they came to a stately mansion, which looked as though it belonged to someone of great importance. There they reined in their horses. A chamberlain led them to a full fountain court, where they were received with a welcome cup of wine and offerings of formal hospitality. The child was used to being in strange places among people who stared at him as if he had two heads, but he held fast to Polyperchon's hand. Servants whispered and peeped from doorways and pointed their fingers at him, giggling behind their hands, until the chamberlain clapped and shooed them away. Behind the great open doors of the regent's chamber, low voices sounded. Iskander let go of Polyperchon's reassuring grip and fell back a few steps. Looking up, his head tilted a little. Do I have to go in? Can't I wait here? There was a fish pool. He remembered how he and his nurse Lila used to sail his little boats. Please sit down, refresh yourselves, the chamberlain said with a gracious flourish of his hand. You must be weary after such a long journey. Aridaeus glanced about edgily and fiddled with the hem of his cloak. How are you, sir? The chamberlain said. Do you remember me? I was your father's chamberlain in the palace up the hill. Father? Aridaeus sent a terrified look over his shoulders, as if he expected a ghost to be lurking in the shadows. When you were a boy, I used to play hide and find with you in the gardens. Do you remember? Aridaeus looked confused. The chamberlain put down his hand on Aridaeus' arm and gave it a gentle squeeze. Never mind, sir. That was a long time ago. The chamberlain ordered the slave to have chairs brought out and another to fetch a tray of citrus drinks and sweet cakes, which were set on the little marble table under the shade of the rose arbor. Iskander sat on the floor beside Aridaeus and waited patiently while the servant poured the drinks into small clay cups. He felt scared in this strange house, separated from his mother and all else that was familiar to him. He understood the reasons why they had come here. The regent was dying, just as the magus had died. He bit sparingly into his cake. He'd learned living with soldiers all his life what to do when there was a tragedy unfolding. He willed that all would be well now, that soon Polyperchon would take him to the palace, so he would be reunited with his mother and Nabarzandes, and life would be good again. More men had begun crowding into the courtyard, arriving in twos and threes, bearded warriors in tall plumed helmets and sleekly oil-netted cuirasses, and land barons wearing their finest loom-woven clothes and all their dazzling gold. The sound of their voices grew louder and deeper. They all trooped through and gathered in front of the door of the regent's chambers, exchanging news. Then the great door opened, and the knot of men gave way to allow Polyperchon to enter the regent's chamber. I was going to talk about... I started out writing this as a young adult novel, and after about a year of working on it, I realized it was far too political, so I was advised to start over. I started over with a multiple point of view, which meant I had a lot of characters to deal with and had to decide which were the ones that were going to actually have the most important parts. And one of the ways that I had of developing these characters was trying to find people that I could identify with as probably what that person might have been like. One incident was, I went into a post office in northern Greece, and there was a man working in the post office, and I knew he was by General Perdiccas. And I went back and forth to that post office quite a few days making notes, watching him. Another one was by, most of the characters in the book are historical, but there were a few fictional characters I had to put, in particular the Persians. So one of my Persian characters, Nabarzandes, the court advisor, who becomes almost like a father figure to the child. I was just developing that character, and I used to go to a place on the drive called the Latin Quarter, and one night I was in there and this man walked in and I knew that was him.
I was quite sure he was probably Persian. It turned out, to make a long story short, that he actually was from Baghdad, from Babylon. And his name was Jabbar. He's an artist who was living here. The UN had sent him here to escape it was during this time of Saddam. So he and I became very good friends. And the more I knew about him, the more my character of Nabuzani's developed. The little boy, I was working in a daycare in Strathcona, and there was a little Asian boy who was very precocious. And I thought, that's him. That's the way, they called him Iskander in the book. That's his Persian name. That's the way Iskander would be. So I used to watch him and make little notes about him. And so this was one of the processes that I used to get my characters. Now, Aridaeus, Alexander's brother, who was one of the joint kings, he had been poisoned when he was 3 years old, and his mentality never got beyond the age of a 3-year-old. He looked like a normal man, but he wasn't. So, and he had seizures. So I did a lot of research on people that had epilepsy and things like that. The villain of the book, Cassandros, the more I read about the stuff that he actually had done, I realized he was probably a psychopath. So I did a lot of research on psychopaths. So those are just some of the things that I used. And one day, I had two critique readers before I sent my book away. One is my friend Bernarda, who's here tonight. She's the grammar nuts person. And the other one was reading to tell me what parts of the book she thought I could cut. Well, one day the other friend, Ingrid, phoned and she said, "How is everybody?" I thought she was talking about our social group. I said, "Oh, who? Oh no, the people in the book." She said, "How are they? I really miss them." And when she said that, I knew that I had got it, so that these people were alive and off the page. So, and of course, my only other thing I was going to talk about, well, I love traveling. And I've been a little gypsy since I was first able to walk. I'm surprised my parents didn't have gray hair by the time they were in their 30s from all the antics that adventures I'd go on. I still travel, mostly a solo traveler. I don't hang out at 5-star resorts. I like going places where there's interesting historical things to see and interesting stuff like that. And I've been a travel journalist since 1983. I went from high school to work for the Vancouver Sun in the newsroom, and I wanted to be a crime reporter, but they wouldn't let me because I was an 18-year-old preacher's daughter, and I wasn't supposed to know about crime. But I used my early journalistic things later, and in 1983, I think, on, I started, because I was living in Greece at the time and I was traveling, I started writing travel, so I've been a travel journalist ever since then, too. So that's my story.
Great. Wow, okay, good. I'm sure there must be a few questions for Ruth.
Yeah.
Your books are they're so epic and they're so well polished and they flow so evenly. I wonder what editing advice you have to other people who are writing on epic projects.
Well, I belong to an extremely good critiquing group called the Scribblers. We meet every Monday night. They were the first people that were critiquing my work as I was writing it, and when I got through to the end, well, actually, it was so long, I kept on going and going. I hired a very, very good editor. I actually ended up, I can't remember if I did this before, I think it was before I gave her the thing. I actually edited out about 500 pages. And when I gave it to her, she did such a good job of the editing of it. It was like really, really good. So that the publisher said to me, "I know you have a really good editor," because there was hardly anything
that had to be done, excepting the printers did a really bad job, especially in the second volume. There was the printing of it. They jumped spaces and things. That wasn't part of the proofreading. So I don't know what went wrong there. But as far as the editing was concerned, get a good editor, belong to a good critique group, one that you can really rely on. And I think that's the two most important things. Yeah.
Do you tend to write kind of ad hoc, or do you develop your outline really detailed?
Well,
before?
this one I was writing from a historical timeline, so I kind of knew from the beginning to the end how the ending was going to be, and you couldn't change it. The one that I'm working on right now is pretty well purely fiction, excepting I'm using a couple of historic events in it. And it's going to be first-person narrative, and I'm finding it much harder to write. So, but I kind of know what the ending is. I know where the ending is, so that I know where I'm going. But in between, I don't know some of the things that are going to happen.
How do you work through that?
I don't know. It just comes to you. It was funny, reading back. I've been, getting the manuscript of Shadow ready to go up on a Kindle and reading it over. I don't know how I wrote that. Honest to God, I was in a zone somewhere. I don't know where I found those words. It was unbelievable. And I'm worried now because the one I'm working on now is just not the same way. I just don't know how it's going to turn out. So, that all the questions?
I have one more. What do you do with the material that gets cut? Like, does it go somewhere else, or you just gently let it go?
No, I have a box under. In fact, I was looking at this box yesterday. I thought, it's all the whole original manuscript. Shall I check it? And I thought, no, I really want to write a novel about Alexander's mother, Olympias, and there's stuff in there that I know that I cut, that I think I might be able to incorporate. So I'm not going to throw it all out just yet. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do you stay committed to one project?
Well, again, I say when I was writing Shadow of the Lion, I was just in some kind of a zone, and I did a lot of the writing. From 1990, I lived in Greece from 83 to 87 before I started the book. I started the book in about 89 as a young adult, and then I decided to change to, by 93, I was going to write it as a multiple point of view, and I quit my daycare job because I was working in daycare, and I went to live in Greece 6 months at a time while I was researching and writing, and then when I came back, I was only working in daycare part-time so that I had more time, because it was a big commitment to do it. So other than that, when I was still working, I had certain days of the week that I knew that those were the times that I would spend on my writing. But you have to be quite disciplined about it to get it all done. So.
One more.
A few more questions. Excellent.
The Scribblers group, how did you get to find out about it?
That started back in the early 1990s. There was a night school class, and then when the night school class ended, they met with the instructor at some people's homes, but then he was moving away, and he said, you should keep this group going. So I was invited into it. For a while, my friend Renata was in it too. We keep it to about 12 people, and there's 3 readers each week. So it allows you to read a good piece. And it's kept on going ever since. It's strictly critiquing. And it's very good critiquing. Yeah. So. And I have 2 copies of Shadow of the Lion, Blood on the Moon here, if anybody's interested in those. And there's some, my business card and some bookmarks there too. Thank you.
Were there a couple more questions, or I saw a couple other hands go up? Yeah.
I know you spent a very long time on this, but I'm curious, when you were doing the actual historical research, what kind of sources and resources did you use?
Oh, I had so much help when I went to Greece. First of all, in 1993, when I was working at this daycare, the daycare board, this is another story, the daycare board were the board from hell. And that's right about the time when former Yugoslavia was trying to steal the name Macedonia. And I had written a letter to the editor, and the Greek consul saw it. And I went in and I told him about my book that I was starting to write on Alexandria. They said, when you want to go back to Greece, we'll fly you there. So I went back to Greece. A journalist friend of mine there got me in touch with the Greek, not the national tourism, the main thing, I forget what it's called. And then I had an interview with the Society of Macedonian Studies in Thessaloniki. Then I had a lot of help from the Finnish Institute. I knew the director from the Finnish Institute, so they got me a museum pass so I could go into any site with my pass. And I met a lot of classical scholars that were part of the group that I was hanging out with that were really helpful. So, yeah, and I went to as many of the sites I could get to. I couldn't get to Baghdad. I couldn't get to Babylon. I could have gone to Syria. Unfortunately, that's one of my big regrets. When I had the money to go, I didn't go. But I finally got to Egypt in 2014. I was invited with a small group from the Egyptian tourism to go. And when they found out about my book, I had a special trip to Alexandria. So that was a big thrill. So, yeah, because Alexandria is there's quite a bit about Alexandria in the book with Ptolemy. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.